to talk about fairy more generally, I mean, what do you fall into any particular school of thought about kind of what they represent? Let's say in sort of some of the classic stories, some of the classic medieval fairy stories, what do these creatures actually represent to you? Not talking about like the demonic spirits that are explicitly labeled as such in your story, but some of these more ambiguous beings.
Well, I mean, I find the legends behind them, the explanations behind them interesting and curious. The descendants of Cain or the dirty children that were behind the door when God came to see Eve and so on. I find those interesting. I can't say that any one of them strikes me as why I was attracted to that. I think I'm attracted to the idea of liminal places and margins where you're between worlds. And fairy is always there. I mean, fairy, the difference between fairy and myth, people say, is that, uh, we're into the cosmos when we talk about myth, and we're not. We're into something more domestic when we talk about fairy. And it is, I think, fascinating to think of fairy as that thing which is so close beside you and so possibly dangerous. It's a margin, an edge, and it may be, like it's a little mound at the edge of the field where you live.
Hmm.
Maybe it's a fairy
Right.
mound. There's a certain tree that has a legendary aspect and that fairies haunt, and the queen of fairy has been seen there. All sorts of things like that are part of an ordinary landscape and yet are tinged with some kind of danger and power. And I also think it's wonderfully interesting that fairies have this thing called glamour, where they can appear to be something so potent and beautiful that it will draw you, even though underneath it's all dead leaves and rotten fruit or whatever. And that seems to have a very clear kind of relationship to many things in our lives, and sometimes with
Hmm.
encounters that we've had with people we don't think are fairies, but who
Hmm.
don't turn out to be what they seemed. And then the whole idea that there's more to life than what we see in a larger sense, that
Right.
there's more than what we know, that this world is a kind of symbolic realm that can be read and understood as more. All those things kind of link up with the idea of fairy.
Right. Yeah, I do like that distinction between fairy and myth. I mean, this idea of Christianity as the true myth is something I've been thinking about lately. I've never been quite on board with it. I mean, it depends what you mean by myth, I guess. If you mean myth in kind of an abstract sense of story and the value that we get from story, versus a kind of like an abstracted account of reality, I would agree. But then to put it in the same category with kind of the pagan myths, and well, I guess what I find interesting is, and here I'm talking more about Lewis's approach than Tolkien's, is Lewis's approach seems to be so different from the approach like the early church fathers, took to the pagan myths, who were quite ready to appropriate aspects of pagan philosophy, but they didn't really take the same aspect, the attitude towards pagan myths. You notice, say, with Justin Martyr or
Mm-hmm.
somebody like that. There was a distinction there. So it wasn't that they were against appropriating anything that came from the pagan world, but they seemed to think of myths as basically demonic deceptions or sort of mockeries of the, the Old Testament prophecies and things like that. And that's kind of more the angle that's taken to a certain extent in that Lord of Spirits episode. For example, when they suggest that the story of Prometheus may be sort of like propaganda on behalf of
Yes,
the serpent, in the
right.
story of the fall, which I is a view that I find very compelling.
It's
Um,
really interesting.
and now, so I guess what I struggle with, not so much the idea of Christianity as the true myth, but the sort of implication that myth as a category, and I don't mean as an abstract category of storytelling or something like that, but as a category of, say, myth meaning the whole body of, pagan stories about the gods, of approaching them with the assumption that there is some underneath the literal application to actual deities is always going to be some deep truth about reality. That, do you see what I'm saying? I don't know that it's necessarily helpful to always approach them with the assumption that they're really conveying underneath something deep about reality, as opposed to perhaps a lie about reality or just nonsense.
Part of it is our words that myth has so many different meanings now, which it didn't in the
Right.
past. But if we
Right.
stick to myth as a a story that has lasted over a great deal of time, that attempts to explain something essential about the world, then we can certainly say there can be wrong myths that are untrue, or myths that are right, as in the Lord of Spirits, they certainly claim that many myths can be propaganda for Satan. And so I think you can then kind of take the modern ideas about myth and say, okay, in some cases, yes, this is just a myth. It doesn't tell us truth about the world. Or maybe we have to turn it inside out and say it tells us truth about the demonic world. And that is opposed to, the Christian story. So that, you could take something like, all right, God breathes life into Adam, and you oppose that on the other side to a pagan myth in which a pagan priest breathes the breath, supposedly, of life into an idol. And obviously, very different ideas about the world, and the idol doesn't actually breathe, although I did give my idol some breath in Center of the
Right.
Wildwood. So
yeah, I mean, and the other thing is that it seems like hard to reconcile the like deep truth reading with reading these myths in like the context of how they actually functioned in the cultures in which they were told, as part of this sort of now obviously when you get to some of the Greek and Roman poets at a certain point, or some of the plays, it may be at a certain point it is detached from any real religious context, and it's just they're kind of using these stories to sort of do their own thing poetically. But it does seem like that looking at this sort of like this inversion or this mockery or this propagandistic aspect, it does often reveal things when you look at them in that light. And so I'm not sure how to reconcile that with the sort of, there's like a deep human truth underneath all, or cosmic truth underneath all of these things, that kind of reading. Again, as you say, it really depends on how you define myth, to some extent. I just, it's an interesting topic. It seems like this sort of like Christianity as the true myth. Lewis is so popular that it seems like a lot of people have just sort of like accepted this idea.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I just feel like I'm not totally rejecting it, but I'm questioning it a little bit. But one of the reasons I bring it up is that Faerie seems a little bit different. because it's always had this more ambiguous status, because at least as it comes down to us in sort of like the European context, it isn't like immediately connected to religion. It's not immediately connected to beings who are worshipped, even if it like may have sort of some genealogy in that way. And so it does seem like a way to explore sort of the whole like enchantment theme and the way that we view reality, and also yes, some of these things that there's more to heaven and earth that is dreamt of in our philosophy, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
aspect, in a way that you're more free to play around with than if you were, say, writing from a Christian perspective, writing a story in which your characters are Venus and whoever else, or Odin or whatever. Does that make sense? It does seem like Faerie is a more appropriate, is a more like fitting playground for a Christian, fantasist in a way.
I think that seems true. It's certainly an arena where you're simply not having to deal with. I mean, one of the things about Lord of the Spirits is it took so many existing stories and just flipped them upside down, so that many stories that we thought of as like the one you mentioned, Prometheus, as
Mm-hmm.
completely positive. Yeah, we want fire. Uh, we want fire both in literal fire, and we want fire of the mind. And sure, it sounds like a wonderful story. And then Lord of Spirits comes along, and Father Stephen DeYoung and Andrew Damick just turn it absolutely upside down for us, so that we look at it in an entirely different way. And
Right.
they perform that really for so many stories all at once in that podcast, so that yeah, we see the world of myth in a very different way than we really ever have before. I don't think that
Right.
view has really been promulgated before, and
Yeah.
it is something that turns our normal view of myth upside down. So
Right. I mean, it is a very like it's almost like a patristic way of looking at it, combined with maybe some of the insights about storytelling that have come from like the more modern school of thinking about myth, but still looking at it from this kind of like critical patristic perspective,
mhm,
if that makes sense.
yeah, no, great.
Um, yeah, and for the listener, we actually haven't specified the title of that episode because I'm sure some people are wanting to check it out now. So the podcast is called The Lord of Spirits, and that episode is called A Land of Giants, I think. And I'll link to it in the show notes. But yeah, so I don't know, just listening to that, I guess what last year or whenever I heard it, has gotten me reevaluating some of these kind of like commonplaces that we hear, about, the function of myth or Christianity as true myth. Yeah, it's all interesting stuff. And so, it's fascinating. Did you send them a copy of this book?
No, I should. I did write Father Stephen DeYoung a note, but who knows if he ever got it. So I, well, maybe I should.